Hey guys, it's Penguin here, and welcome back to another gold making video. In today's video, we will be continuing our War Within profession breakdown series by taking a look at Inscription. I know a lot of people have been wondering about Inscription as it doesn't get as much love as other professions. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at profession equipment, recipes, specializations, different builds, milling, and all of that, and ultimately how you can make gold with this profession going into the War Within. But as always, everybody, thank you so much for watching the videos. There'll be timestamps in the description down below. Feel free to skip around because I know these videos are a bit longer, and if you enjoy, leaving a like or even subscribing would be amazing. But without further ado, let's get started. And so starting off, many of you probably know the drill by now, but let's first cover your best in slot profession equipment. And Inscription is actually pretty simple. You're going to be relying on jewel crafters to make both of your accessories. Your novelist specs as well as your forager's font inspectors will both come from jewel crafting. So feel free to either pick up jewel crafting for yourself, or you'll just have to find a jewel crafter through the work order system to help craft it for you. Additionally, your quill, which will be your tool of choice, is also made from Inscription. So you can either make that yourself, or you'll have to find another skilled scribe to do that for you. As always, do remember these are the names of your best in slot version, which is that blue quality, but you'll simply be able to buy the green quality from the auction house or easily be able to produce it yourself. So make sure you grab the green versions and then slowly upgrade as you get artisan acuity. But that's it for profession tools, and let's move on to recipes. Now, in terms of Inscription recipes, there's not actually that many, and the ones that are available are mostly from vendors. Now, this is good as in you don't really have to rely on any sort of RNG in terms of drops. However, that does mean that you need a lot of artisan acuity. Up first, we have all of the profession-related missives. There are 7 of them, I believe, yep, right here, and this corresponds to all of the different profession stats that crafting as well as gathering professions have. And each one of these missives cost 150 artisan acuity at the vendor inside the main city, which is pretty expensive, right? This is technically easy to do, but if you want all 7 recipes, that's 7 times 150, that is going to take a while to achieve. So if you decide to go after these missives, definitely be careful on which one you decide to unlock first. Up next, we have contracts, and similar to Dragonflight, these are all locked behind Renown, but once again, they actually do cost 150 artisan acuity each. It looks like I only have that right here. We can actually fix that right now. But these do correspond to all of their related renowns, and it just is going to require more artisan acuity. The good news is that the renown level is low. Also remember, renown is account-wide, so that really won't be an issue. Yet again, you're just going to be limited by the amount of acuity you have. Up next, we do have 2 drops right here. This is actually your best in slot profession equipment tool we just looked at. This does come from treasures, specifically the wax encrusted chest, and your high quality alchemist mixing rod if you want to craft that for other people. This will be a drop from Delves. We've seen this before, but if you're looking for profession equipment, if that's going to be your main way of making gold, that does require some RNG. Then of course, lastly, we do have our PvP related gear. Very similar to Dragonflight, we have the 3 different trinkets. These are simply purchased from the vendor for 7,500 honor apiece, or you can buy the recipe off the auction house since it's BOE. And we also have a few different weapons. This time around, we have the lamp, which is considered an offhand, then we have the pillar, which is a 2-handed polearm, and then of course we have a staff, which is simply a 2-handed staff. So there's a few more options in terms of PvP gear, which is pretty nice, but if these are anything like, especially the trinkets, if they are anything like the Dragonflight trinkets, they sell fast. So definitely keep these on your radar for the War Within. But alright, with that out of the way, we can actually dive in game, and let's take a closer look at all of the actual recipes that Inscription has to offer. Up first, of course, Inscription is built off milling, and that's exactly what we see in this expansion as well. We'll cover milling in just a few moments after we look at recipes, but I will say this milling is probably the simplest it has been. It's very, very straightforward, which will be nice compared to Dragonflight and other different expansions. Up next, we have two basic inks, which will drive all of Inscription crafting. The first one is your shadow ink right here, which uses 2 of the different pigments, and then you have your applique ink, which uses the 2 other pigments. So especially compared to Dragonflight, this is a lot more simplistic. We're only dealing with 2 inks compared to like the 4 or 5 we saw from Dragonflight. Moving forward, we have 2 basic reagents. Now, keep in mind, everything that you see here that is learned, this is all trainer-learned recipes, but it's kind of following the same trend. We have 2 basic reagents. The first one is your codified greenwood. This is very similar to bark from Dragonflight, and we also have these boundless ciphers. So yet again, these 2 inks, as well as these 2 reagents, are really the backbones of this profession. Up next, we have our basic BOE items. This is one of your 2-handed staffs. This one right here is another version of your 2-handed staff, and then you have an offhand. So if you are interested in staffs or offhands, this will be the profession you want to choose. Up next, we have our combat-related missives, so all of our non-profession-related missives. These will be applied to all of your high-end crafted gear. So whether it's cloth gear, plate gear, weapons, etc., anything like that, you can apply a missive to. So for example, this one right here applies critical strike and mastery. We have these exact same things in Dragonflight. They're just the newer versions. Then we have our starter green versions of our profession equipment. Right here, this is your basic cooking tool, so chefs will be after this. Then we have our basic mixing rod for alchemist. And lastly, we have our basic quills, which you're definitely going to want to craft yourself and get one as soon as possible. Then the last trainer recipe, like I said, there's not really many here, and that is your basic Vantis rune. And so this is for the first raid for the first season, and so if you are interested in Vantis runes, you're going to get it immediately from the trainer, which does mean there will probably be more competition because it's not any sort of rare recipe. Moving forward, we do have a few interesting things that are tied, whether that's from specializations or drops like we saw earlier, and the first thing is actually transcription. Now, things like this have existed in other expansions, but what this is going to allow you to do is turn some unusable or unwanted Darkmoon cards into a specific card you're looking for. In this case, if you decide to unlock this one, you'll be able to transcribe 2 of your unwanted cards into a Ascension card. So let's just say the Darkmoon deck of Ascension is the best in slot, it's the highest value, and you have a bunch of Ace of Radiances laying around, or they happen to be the cheapest on the auction house. You can trade in 2 of these Aces of Radiance, as well as 1 Shadow Ink, and get 1 of your Ascension cards, hopefully to complete that deck and, make profit. In terms of how useful this is going to be really depends on the prices of everything. Ultimately depends on how lucrative Darkmoon decks actually are. In Dragonflight, they weren't that exciting, but who knows, maybe this time around they'll actually be better. One thing to point out is that if you have seen my tailoring video, well, if you haven't seen my tailoring video, I highly recommend checking it out. But in that video, I talk about profession bags, and the Inscription profession bag itself actually affects these transcriptions. So if you're looking to do any sort of Darkmoon deck crafting, or any sort of transcribing, you will definitely want to get your hands on that Inscription bag. I'll have a screenshot of the current buff at the moment, but that's something to keep in mind if you're interested in this type of crafting. Continuing the theme of Darkmoon items, we also have Darkmoon sigils, which is a brand new type of embellishment, as well as Darkmoon decks. For example, this one right here is your Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, and you'll realize that it actually requires a deck to craft. So there are 4 different Darkmoon decks in this expansion, very similar to Dragonflight and others, and they are crafted the exact same way. You need a complete set of cards, so aces through 8, combine them all and you'll get this Darkmoon deck. The only thing is that Darkmoon cards are actually obtained through fishing. There may be some other sources as well, but the primary way to actually get cards is through fishing. There's no way to actually craft the cards themselves. There is a way to transcribe them, but you're gonna have to have cards to actually transcribe. So definitely, if you are interested in this, once again, picking up fishing will be important. In terms of how useful these are, I'm not exactly sure. It's going to depend on best in slot charts and all of that, but you can take a look. This is your Ascension deck. This is the Radiance deck. This is the Symbiosis deck. And lastly, we have this one right here. Now, the interesting thing is that we now have the introduction of sigils. And what these are embellishments. They're made for your weapons, so you can tie these to your crafted weapons, and they actually give you the buff of the deck. So for example, right here, if we take a look at this Darkmoon deck, as you can see, when it's equipped, you're going to gain Ascendance every 8 seconds spent in combat, and what Ascendance does is grants a random secondary stat for 15 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. The issue though is that with this deck is that you're stuck at item level 577, and let's face it, 577 is not going to be a great item level. So this deck will likely become very, very quote-unquote useless in terms of that item level. It's just not going to be as good as other things. So what you'll be able to do is turn it into this BOE sigil, where you can attach it to one of your high-end unembellished weapons, and you'll gain the exact same bonuses. So once again, this says gain Ascendance every 8 seconds spent in combat, and Ascendance grants a random secondary stat for 15 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. You'll notice that this one says, 145 of a random stat. This one says 89, so keep that in mind. But this is just going to be a way of making the actual decks useful without actually having to use the decks themselves. Of course, these do require the deck to actually craft, so these will be probably pretty expensive, but it does make this market pretty interesting. And these sigils, as well as the transcriptions, they all come from Specializations, which we'll take a look at in just a second. But there's a sigil for every single Darkmoon deck, so if you're interested in this, definitely stick around, and we'll talk about how to craft these in a little bit. Moving forward, we have other classic things that we expect. Right here, these are just your high-end weapons. So for example, here's your two-handed staff. This is your other version of your two-handed staff. And lastly, you have your torch. Unlike other professions, all 3 of these recipes come from Specializations, which is pretty nice. And these do have the ability to add an embellishment. So this is exactly where you could apply a sigil if you wanted to use it on your character. You also have the ability to add a missive, which is what we talked about before. Then, just like we saw in the recipes list earlier, these are your 4 different contracts, and what these do is just give you more reputation every time you complete a world quest. So this one right here will give you 10 reputation, and it ultimately just depends on the quality, but the nice thing is that this is just going to be a very easy way of gaining passive extra reputation, which will be important for some of those reputation-based unlocks. Then we have the profession-based missives, which we saw earlier, and these are applied and used on your profession tools to guarantee a certain stat. Depending on the type of crafter, it will kind of depend on which one you want, but for example, let's say you're doing reagent crafting and you're going to be able to max out that craft, you're going to want a multi-craft tool, because multi-craft is most powerful when you can guarantee quality. However, if you're going, let's say, the crafted armor or crafted weapon route, where ingenuity is very important, you're going to be spending concentration, you're definitely going to want a missive of ingenuity to guarantee your tool has it. So depending on the type of crafter or gatherer you're going to be, you're going to want to make sure you get that missive applied to your tool. Up next, we just have the higher end profession equipment. We saw this earlier. The rolling pin comes from the treasure, the quill actually comes from Specializations, and the mixing rod comes from delves. Then lastly, profession treaties are not going away. These existed in Dragonflight, and what these are just a weekly way of getting an extra knowledge point, or 2, depending on your profession, and these are simply unlocked through discovery of specialization trees. Once again, we'll take a look at that in just 1 second. But especially if you are a crafter yourself, if you have a ton of alts, being able to produce these for yourself or for others will definitely be a nice way to make some extra gold. Then, truly at last, we have all of our basic PvP gear. We have our 3 trinkets, which is your emblem, your insignia, as well as your medallion. And then we have the lamp, we have the pillar, and the staff, like we mentioned previously. But yeah, that's kind of the basic layout of recipes, and you'll probably notice by now that Inscription really hasn't changed much. And when it has changed, it's kind of become simpler. If we wanted to quickly cover milling, it is actually pretty simple. In my spreadsheet, I do have a little bit of a table just in case you want to overlook that, so feel free to take a look at the spreadsheet, but it's going to correspond to really what herb you're milling. For example, there are 4 main different types of herbs. You have your Blessing Blossom, you have your Orbinid, you have your Lure Drop, and you have your Myco Bloom. And what these are going to do is just give you the corresponding pigment. For example, if we decide to mill Lure Drop, we're going to get Lure Drop pigment. If we decide to mill Orbinid, we'll get Orbinid pigment. And lastly, if we decide to mill Blessing Blossom, we're going to get Blessing pigment, or Blossom pigment. So that is very, very easy to keep track of. Myco Bloom is slightly different in terms that it's going to give, now this is probably pronounced wrong, but this is going to give nacreous pigment. Yet again, it's only going to give nacreous pigment, but it just has a slightly different name. And finally, the last special thing, we have this rainbow fish, which is pretty hard to fish up right now on beta, but I was able to mill it twice, and both times it also gave me nacreous pigment. That could change in the future, but at the end of the day, it's basically just, hey, if you need this specific pigment, you need to mill this specific herb. So it should be very easy to follow. And how that corresponds with ink is also very simple. Freshwater right here is just a vendor item, so if you needed to make a ton of shadow ink, you basically just need to mill Orbinid as well as Blessing Blossom. And if you needed to make a bunch of the other ink, you need to mill Lure Drops as well as Myco Bloom or the fish to get the nacreous pigment. And that's it for milling. There's really nothing special in terms of, okay, you know, it gives me 80% this and 20% this. It's simply just a 1-to-1 relation. Additionally, in terms of leveling, it's also pretty easy. Simply through trainer learned recipes, you're going to hit 70 out of 100, which is enough to unlock 3 out of your 4 specialization trees, so you're pretty well off. The only downside is that once you get to 70 out of 100, it is pretty hard to level up. You do have the option of crafting either one of these high-end profession equipment, but the issue is that this is not going to get you all the way up to 100. So it can be a temporary fix, but it's not going to help you all the way. Really, your only options is through sigils or through weapons, which are simple specialization unlocks. The only downside is that the sigils themselves do require a deck, so unless you're doing this through crafting orders or something like that, that can be pretty expensive. You know, Darkmoon decks normally go for a few thousand gold each, especially at the start of the expansions, it will go for thousands and thousands of gold. And then the bad side about weapons is that they require 2 sparks. So already not only are you relying on sparks, but you also need people to be able to get 2, which is going to be a few weeks of waiting. So in terms of getting to that actual 100 point, it will be a little bit difficult, but just once again throwing out a suggestion. In order to unlock all 4 profession trees, you need to hit 75 out of 100. So you're only 5 points away. Meaning if the Darkmoon deck situation is too expensive and people aren't going to provide it through work orders, and you don't want to wait for weapons, you can go for one of these and hope you can get some people who need them because you do require artisan acuity. But even if these can't get you to 100, they could at least get you to that 75 mark, which will allow you to unlock your 4th specialization. It's ultimately up to you, and this is still beta, things might change, which is why I'm not being too specific, but once the actual expansion comes out, I'll have an updated leveling guide, a part of that spreadsheet as well, to help you out a little bit more. But finally, we have specializations, and thankfully, this is going to be pretty easy as well. Similar to most of the other professions we've already done in this series, Inscription has its basic tree, and this is called the Pursuit of Knowledge. And what this is going to give you is just a bunch of overall stats for all of your crafts. So right here you have your ingenuity tree. So if you're going for a lot of ingenuity, this is going to be the tree for you. Remember, this affects all recipes. Then we have our resourcefulness tree, which is the exact same. We've seen this for many of the other professions. Then you have your multitasking or your multicraft tree once again. However, the thing that I do want to point out is this main tree. Immediately upon learning this tree, you're going to unlock your first treaty, which is very spectacular. What this is going to allow you to do is not only craft a treaty for yourself, but this is how you actually unlock the rest of the treaties. So this treaty itself comes from the specialization. You can start crafting this, but in order to unlock the others, you actually have to discover them. So technically, if you're not afraid of spending a bunch of gold, you can immediately start crafting a bunch of the treaties, kind of save them for yourself, or if people order them through the work order system, you can do that as well. But immediately you can unlock all of these recipes, which gives you a lot of first craft bonuses, and these will help all of your alts. If you are creating an alt army for your tailoring or for your alchemist, then that's going to be a very easy way to get them an additional knowledge point by just simply crafting treaties. Of course, as you put more points into here, you're going to gain other bonuses. You're going to gain resourcefulness, multicraft, and ingenuity. But the last thing I want to mention is that you're actually going to then gain an additional knowledge point. What treaties do is that you can use one once a week and it will reward you 1 knowledge point. However, if you decide to max out Pursuit of Knowledge, now your scribe will gain 2 knowledge points, which of course is not a crazy bonus, but if you happen to unlock this and craft it, for 5 weeks, you now have 5 more knowledge points than somebody without this bonus. So it's something to definitely look towards. But really, no matter what you're doing in Inscription, this is going to be a tree you want to focus your points into. Up next, following the trend of crafting reagents, we have Pursuit of Perfection, and this is going to be for all of your intermediate crafting. Up first, this main one is just going to give you skill, and this is going to affect your reagent crafting, your ink crafting, as well as your milling. And you guys can pause if you want to read more about it, but you're basically just going to gain a bunch of skill. If you want to focus purely on crafting inks, then this will be the sub node for you. Once again, you'll be able to gain a bunch of skill. You'll also gain the ability to use finishing reagents, which can improve your profits, and a bunch more skill yet again. And then finally, you'll gain a crafting speed bonus, which can be useful when crafting in bulk. Similarly, we have the improved milling. So if you're going to be focusing on milling, or you're going to be doing the whole process of milling and then crafting inks, this will be the tree for you. Yet again, you'll gain a bunch of skill, and then lastly, you'll gain that crafting speed bonus. And finally, you'll have this for your reagent crafting. This is a little bit confusing. The name of it is Improved Ciphers, and it says improve the quality of your ciphers. However, this also applies to greenwood. So if you're crafting greenwood or ciphers, this tree is going to affect it. Yet again, you'll gain the ability to use finishing reagents, a bunch of skill, and lastly, you'll gain that crafting speed. So if you're purely going to just be here for reagent crafting, Pursuit of Perfection and Pursuit of Knowledge is going to be the 2 trees for you. Up next, we have Careful Carvings, which is going to be all of your work order stuff. Up first, this left side of the tree, you have everything related to weapons. So of course, you're going to want to unlock the main node, and actually immediately upon unlocking this tree, you're going to be able to choose a sub-spec, which is pretty nice, but you'll also be able to use missives, which yet again is going to be important. And then you have the option, if let's say you're going into weapons, you'll choose this right here, and then you'll immediately be able yet again to choose your final sub-spec. Staffs is going to help you with, of course, staff crafting, and then torches is going to help you with your off-handed weapons, so it's very, very specific. If you decide to immediately spec into torch, you're going to immediately unlock that torch recipe, and then as you put more points in, you're just going to be able to gain a bunch of skill, as well as the use of finishing reagents, so this is pretty simple. And then if you decide to go into staffs, you'll immediately unlock the crutch recipe, which we saw earlier. And then once you put in 5 more points, you'll gain the baton craft. So that really ultimately depends on which recipe you're going for. But yet again, you'll gain the ability to use finishing reagents and then just a bunch of skill. But kind of the nice thing is that let's say you are going weapon crafting to kind of max out your skill level. This is very cheap. This technically required no points whatsoever, and I got my recipe. Of course, I'll be crafting this weapon at a very low quality due to my lack of skill, but this technically required no points at all. It did require me to unlock this tree, but that is a nice, convenient thing. But as always, ultimately, if you want to be the best staff crafter ever, you're going to want to max out all 3 of these nodes. So your main one, and then that mid-tier, as well as the overall major node, to make sure you have the most skill possible. But let's say you don't want to actually craft weapons and you're just here for profession tools, it works the exact same. So instead of picking the left side of the tree, you would go the right side, which immediately will give you the recipe of your high-end quill, which is very nice. So immediately you'll be able to craft yourself the best in slot version. And then you'll also be able to choose a sub-specialization. So it's broken down by the 3 tools you have available. If you want to spec into the quill to make the quill the best possible, there you go. Or you can choose the mixing rod or the rolling pin. Immediately upon learning, you'll be able to use finishing reagents on them, and then you'll just gain a bunch of skill and other stats, and that applies to whichever one you decide to choose. But yeah, to summarize this, if you're going weapons, you're going to want to fill out the left side of the tree and also make sure you go into pursuit of knowledge. And if you're going profession equipment, you'll want to do the right side of the tree and yet again go into pursuit of knowledge. Then lastly, we probably have the fun category, especially as somebody who doesn't like to do crafting orders. This is the fun category for me, and this is going to be everything we haven't talked about. So if you are interested in Darkmoon crafting, then the left side of the tree is going to be for you. Immediately upon unlocking this, we'll be able to choose a sub-specialization, and you can go straight into Darkmoon crafting. Very similar to the other tree we just looked at, you're going to immediately gain the ability to use finishing reagents when crafting sigils, and you'll also be able to choose a sub-specialization. So let's say the Darkmoon sigil for the Symbiosis ends up on your best in slot list, then you can unlock this. This required no points whatsoever, and immediately you have that recipe learned. If I decide to put more points into the specific sigil tree, you'll gain a bunch of skill. Then you'll also be able to increase your ability to find Darkmoon cards, which is going to be very important, especially if you are actually going after the cards yourself. Like I said, cards, the primary source is fishing, so if you are going to end up fishing on this character, definitely speccing into one of these sigils and getting that maxed out immediately is going to be very, very nice. If you continue around, you'll gain more skill, and lastly, this is where you'll gain the ability to actually transcribe cards. So yet again, let's say Symbiosis, cards, and decks are the most expensive, and everything else is pretty cheap. You're definitely going to want to max out this sigil so you can transcribe those other cards into the Symbiosis ones. And this exact same setup occurs with all of the different sigils, meaning if you can put 15 points into every single sigil, you're going to increase your ability to find cards by 200%, because it's a 50% chance times 4 different abilities. Which, if you do want to do that, fair warning, it's going to be a heavy knowledge point investment. In order to actually get all 4 sigil nodes, you have to max this out, which is a 30-point investment, and then that's 15 points each. So you're looking at about 90 points just to get all of those, finding bonuses. But going back to crafting, this middle node is just going to give you more skill, so very, very nice. And then of course you have your main node, which is going to give you skill for everything in this specific tree. Of course, if you don't want to do Darkmoon crafting, then you have the right side of the tree, which is going to be for everything else. So you have for contracts, you have missives, and you have Vantisserns. And just like before, it's going to be a straight shot depending on what you want to focus on. If you're going really in-depth into contract crafting, then you're going to want to unlock the middle node. Then you're going to want to choose a runic research as your middle node instead of cryptic collection, and then you'll go straight into contracts. This will just give you a bunch of skill and resourcefulness, which is very nice, and of course at the very end you'll get that crafting speed bonus as well. Then yet again, same exact thing for missives and same exact thing for your Vantis rune recipe. So yeah, the nice thing is that specializations are very straightforward. It's ultimately just going to come down to how you want to specialize into things. For example, let's say you were really interested in missive and contract crafting because you really like the fast pace of the region-wide auction house. You kind of have two options. What you can do is immediately spec into contracts and then max out contracts themselves, and you'll gain a bunch of skill as well as other things, and then you can move on to that middle node and then lastly that top node, just to gain all of the stats possible for crafting contracts. However, what you can also do is instead of maxing out this final node first, you can put points towards the middle node. Not only will you also gain skill, but eventually you'll be able to choose a secondary subspec, which then would allow you to go into missives as well and gain skill for them. Keep in mind that these middle nodes as well as the top node affects all crafts in this tree, so that's definitely something you're going to have to work on and figure out what exactly you want to do. At the end of the day, it might not matter that much because a lot of crafts require you to have almost all of your points allocated to them to actually max them out, but especially when you're kind of balancing resourcefulness, multi-craft, and ingenuity, these are some things you can think about. But yeah, everybody, that's about it. Just for a quick summary, of course, your pursuit of knowledge is going to affect everything, so no matter what path you choose, definitely put points into this tree. If you're interested in just normal reagent crafting, milling, or ink crafting, then Pursuit of Perfection is going to be for you. If you're interested in either weapon or profession tool crafting, so anything to deal with work orders, then Careful Carvings will be the tree for you. And then lastly, Archival Editions is for either your Darkmoon deck crafting and sigil crafting, or for your contracts, missives, and Vantis runes. But overall, I hope this video was helpful. As always, if there's anything major that changes between now and release, I will have a comment with all of those updates down below. But Inscription is basically Inscription. This profession really didn't have any major overhauls like last expansion, but the nice thing is that these sigils do give an opportunity for Darkmoon decks to actually be useful, which really wasn't the case in Dragonflight. So we'll have to see how things turn out, but let me know what exactly you're excited for in Inscription, or maybe you're not excited whatsoever. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and have a good day.